And a very warm welcome to the LBC Book Club. That's what we always do on a Monday night here on London's Biggest Conversation. We talk to an author who's got a book out, or an author or two. Now, tonight, we're going to talk to a single author for the next hour. His name is Jonathan Powell. He was Tony Blair's Chief of Staff from 1994 through till 2007, when Tony Blair left office. And he's written a book called The New Machiavelli. The subtitle is How to Wield Power in the Modern World. Now, in a sense, it's quite an intimidating title for a book. And I've had this book on my bookshelves ever since it was first published in hardback last year. It's just come out in paperback. And to be honest, first of all, welcome to the programme, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
To be honest, the title almost put me off reading it. And we've had the Mandelson book, we've had the Alastair Campbell diaries, we've had Tony Blair's book. And obviously, because you've come on the programme, I have got around to reading it. But I wonder whether I'm typical in that.
You may well be, but I just felt there were going to be so many memoirs from the Blair years, all tumbling out, as you say, Tony's, Peter's, Alastair's, and there needed to be a different angle on it. So I wanted to look at it through Machiavelli's eyes and see if his lessons still applied, rather than just writing yet another memoir.
Because again, it's a very innovative thing to do, to do it that way. So, because I mean, in a sense, it is a political memoir, but you've compared it with Machiavelli. Now, why did you want to do it that way?
Well, partly because being in number 10, you get lots of books on the theory of government, and they're all very interesting about how government should work, but absolutely nothing that tells you how you should exercise power. And if you look for a how-to or a handbook for a practitioner of power, there's nothing out there. And you really have to go all the way back to Machiavelli's The Prince to do that. The other reason was, at university, I studied Machiavelli's The Prince. It's one of those few books that was short enough. You read the whole thing rather than just the introduction and the conclusion.
It's about
so it stuck in my mind.
Pages, isn't it?
It's 90 pages. I couldn't
like
manage his skill of 90 pages, but it's an excellent book.
And I mean, everybody thinks. I mean, those who maybe don't know much about Machiavelli, we have this phrase, "Oh, well, that's a very Machiavellian thing to do," as a sort of pejorative expression. Whereas actually, a lot of if you read Machiavelli, it's not all cunning and conniving. It's actually some very useful instructions.
Absolutely, Machiavelli got a very bad press, particularly in this country. Actually, even before his book was published here, a book was published called The Anti-Machiavel that sent out the opposite point of view. And it was taken up by Shakespeare and Marlowe, who all have these villains called Machiavel in their plays. So he was seen as evil even before anyone had read his book. But actually what he's about is reality. He's about trying to cut through the myths. He says if you govern by myths, you will undoubtedly fail, and you need to grasp what's really happening. And that was the sort of theme of the book that I really liked. Just tell us
a bit about Machiavelli.
Well, it's funny parallels with me. He was a genius and I'm not, I hasten to add straight away. But what he was he was a sort of diplomat come functionary who worked in Florence in the turn of the 15th century. And then got chucked out of power when another person came into office, tortured. I wasn't tortured, but had to leave office when Tony did, and then wrote his memoirs, political memoirs, after he left. So I saw some comparisons. He did a lot of diplomacy. He did a series of missions for the Florentine government to France, to the Holy Roman Emperor, all of which failed because his bosses were so indecisive. They could never make up their minds what they wanted to do. So he'd be there establishing fantastic relations with the French king, ready to pay him off and make sure he didn't invade Florence. And then the people back home would screw it up by not actually putting out the right instructions.
And you say that there are some parallels between his career and yours. What about the parallels between maybe the people that he worked for and the people that you worked for?
Well, I do use his descriptions of Soderini in particular. He worked for Piero Soderini, who was the ruler of Florence, who he described as chronically indecisive. He could never make his mind up, always agonised. And he described this as the worst failing of a prince, because if you can't make your mind up, you end up in the worst possible circumstances. And I saw a very close comparison there to Gordon Brown, whose failing was not so much his brutality, but actually his failing to ever decide, most classically in the case of the election that never happened, where he sat there agonising, should there or shouldn't there be an election, while his staff were out there briefing there would be an election. And then when he finally saw the opinion polls going south, decided there wouldn't be an election, and announced to the disbelieving public that he'd never thought about having an election in the first place.
We'll come on to Gordon Brown in a little bit more detail later, because let's put it this way, you're not a fan.
No, I try to be objective in what I say, but I don't think you'd have me as a fan.
No, that's possibly one of the most entertaining parts of the book, I have to say. Now, if you'd like to talk to Jonathan, the number to call is 0845 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850 or email ian@lbc.co.uk, because he was at the centre of power for more than a decade in Downing Street. And, the job of Chief of Staff is one that, we've never really had that job title here until it's sort of quite American, isn't it? What does it actually involve?
Well, we created the job. It had existed very briefly before. In 1979, when Mrs. Thatcher came in, she brought with her a businessman who she made Chief of Staff. But the civil service soon saw him off. They put him in the attic, a little tiny room up there, and he didn't see Mrs. Thatcher for 3 months and then gave up. But our conclusion was, looking at the John Major government, that there were no chiefs in Downing Street. There were political people who were in charge of the political section, civil servants in charge of the civil service section. And every Friday evening there'd be an undignified race to put the last memo on top of the Prime Minister's box. And the political aides would stay till very late, but they'd go home, and then the principal private secretary would put one on, and then the cabinet secretary would come in. And I thought we needed someone who brought it all together, who actually could make a decision instead of the Prime Minister, if necessary, between the political and the civil service, the foreign and the domestic, the press and the policy. And Gordon Brown abolished the job when we left as part of his sort of reversal of what Tony Blair had done. But I noticed David Cameron has brought it back. And I noticed that pretty much every other country in Europe and most parts of the world have a Chief of Staff. And I think the post will last.
Just tell us how you came to get the job, because you were a diplomat. And, in case people don't know, your brother was Margaret Thatcher's foreign policy advisor, Charles Powell, as he says.
Charles Powell, yes. No, he was Mrs. Thatcher.
Well, I've got to ask you about that. Why the Powell and Powell thing?
Well, because he's actually probably closer to right than I am. It's a Welsh name, which is Ap Howell, son of Hywel.
Right.
And the correct pronunciation is something like Powell. So he was nearer to the right pronunciation. The trouble is, if you say that on the telephone, you're going to get it spelt P-O-L-E.
Yeah.
So all my other brothers, and all of his children, in fact, all call ourselves Powell. It's just a lot easier.
Bizarre. Anyway, back to the question. Sort of how did you come to get the job? Because you were in the Foreign Office, civil servant, diplomat.
Yeah.
Why would you then cross over into frontline politics?
Well, I'd been sent to the embassy in Washington as the political officer following American politics. And I got there in July 91. And I attached myself to the presidential campaign of one Bill Clinton, who at the time was seen as a complete no-hoper. If you remember, at that time, George Bush Sr. was at 75% approval rating after the Gulf War. And no one thought he could be beaten. And there were candidates called the Seven Doors, including Bill Clinton, because they were all waiting for Mario Cuomo, the governor of New York, to come into the race, who never did. And because I attached myself to him, for the very good reason he'd been at my college at Oxford and no political acumen at all, I got a reputation for being able to predict the outcome of presidential elections, because I said he was going to win, only because I was attached to him. So I suddenly became a genius about politics, completely by mistake. And I spent a whole year following Bill Clinton around. And when he won at the end of 92, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown wanted to come over and meet him, as they were setting up the new Labour franchise to match the new Democrat franchise. So I introduced them to Bill Clinton and his staff when they came over in January, and spent a few days travelling around with them and got to know Tony. And then when he became leader, we kept in touch. When he went back, we kept in touch. Then when he became leader, he called me up and asked me if I'd come and be his Chief of Staff. And I'd had an aspiration to be a Labour MP. Very hard to switch from being a diplomat to being a Labour MP, but that's what I wanted to do. When he offered me the chance to come and be his Chief of Staff, I jumped at it.
Were you held back at all in your Foreign Office career because of your brother? Because, he was a very strong personality in the Thatcher government, and, he really did. He was, along with Bernard Ingham, I would say he was probably her closest advisor. And you relate a little story in your book about Douglas Hurd maybe appointing you to a position when he was Foreign Secretary and then decided not to.
Well, I certainly looked at with a good deal of suspicion in the Foreign Office. I used to go to the permanent secretaries' meetings in the morning, and they'd all complain about something that Charles Powell, my brother, had done in number 10, and they'd all look at me in a meaningful sort of way. So I think I was seen as somehow an agent inside the Foreign Office. And Douglas Hurd interviewed me for the job of an assistant private secretary. And then after talking to me, he looked at me quizzically and said, I just don't think we can do it with the Powell thing. And so I didn't get that job. But no, I don't think I was really held up. If anything, I was probably got advancement for being related to Charles.
Now, the job of Chief of Staff, I guess, because it hadn't really existed in British politics, you made it your own, and you developed it. And after that, virtually every politician in Westminster, whether they have a staff of 2 or 3, they have a chief of staff. Now, you probably don't know this, but I was David Davis's chief of staff in the Tory leadership contest. So in theory, I could have ended up had he won, doing your job. Now, having read your book, I'm so glad that never happened, because I know that I would have been completely useless at it. How did the job develop over the years and change?
I had a clear vision of it when I came in, because I spent a long time in America, not just as a diplomat, but also as a student. So I had my special subject, my hobby is American politics, so I'd observed it very closely. I didn't think it should become a public role in the way that the White House Chief of Staff is. White House Chief of Staff negotiates with Congress, goes on television all the time. I was very clear this should be a backroom role. It should be a role that's trying to make things happen for the Prime Minister. You have several 100,000 civil servants who are stopping things happening, and you need one person who will make things happen, and that's what the Chief of Staff's job is. Bring people together, make things happen, do what the Master wants, but don't try and insert yourself into it. You have to have quite a low ego. And you have to start to actually think like the Prime Minister. My brother, after working for Mrs. Thatcher, I felt began to look like Mrs. Thatcher. His hair got increasingly grey and bouffant grew out. I used to inherit Tony Blair's clothes because I hadn't got time or the money to go and buy my own shirts, and so I used to get his shirts when he no longer wanted them. And I was going to get his suits, but fairly early after I started working with him, he spilt tea over his suit. We had to change before he gave a speech. He was fine, my suit fit him, but his legs are much shorter than mine. I was left with about 6 inches of calf showing and could never therefore inherit his suits. But I did start to think like him.
Well, so you have to, in a way, because you have to make decisions, because the Prime Minister cannot make every single decision, so you have to make some of them for him, and then be prepared to defend them when he says, well, why on earth did you do that?
Yeah. You have to do that, or else the system will just get completely blocked. When Gordon Brown abolished the job, his number 10 became completely frozen. They simply couldn't make decisions because only decisions could be made by Gordon. Even on his diary, it had to be agreed every day by Gordon that morning. He wouldn't delegate that decision to anyone else. In those circumstances, number 10 can simply not work. So you have to have someone there who knows how the Prime Minister thinks, who can make the little decisions for him and knows which of the big decisions he'd want to participate in. Unless you can do that, you can't do the job.
Well, I'm talking to Jonathan Powell. He's the author of The New Machiavelli, former Chief of Staff to Tony Blair. We'll talk much more to him in just a few seconds' time. If you'd like to ask a question yourself, the number to call is 0845 6060 973. This is LBC 97.3. It's 9:15. Time for travel with Alan Cowie.
Thank you, Ian. Just checking the motorway routes M25 note.
And you're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and Jonathan Powell, who's with me. He's written a book called The New Machiavelli, How to Wield Power in the Modern World. It's just been published in paperback, $8.99. If you're in any way interested in politics, the history of the Blair government, this is a book you have to read. I would actually, and I'm not just saying this because he's sat beside me, if you're going to read one book about the Blair government, don't bother with Peter Mandelson. Don't bother with the volumes of Alastair Campbell, even though I think they're fantastic. Don't bother with Tony Blair's book. Read this one, because I tell you what, I think you'll learn more about the way the Blair government operated in this than you would any other of those books. So there's a testament for you, Jonathan.
Very much.
You can put
and
that
it's shorter.
You can put that on the back of the second paperback edition. Power. Now, I published a book back in, I think, 2000 by Gillian Shepherd, the former Tory Education Minister, and it was called Shepherd's Watch, a very original title, which is the best title I've ever thought of for a book. And it was all about power and how she started on a parish council, and she then moved up to being a district councillor, then a county councillor, then she became an MP, then she became a minister, and then she became a cabinet minister. And she felt at every level that she got to, power was at the level above. And she said even as a cabinet minister, she never really felt that she had grabbed power. Now, you say something very similar to that in your book.
That's right. When you get into Downing Street, you think you're finally going to get power, but actually power is like the gold at the end of the rainbow. When you get there, it isn't actually there. I remember Bill Clinton saying when he was president, after about 2 years, he said, you know, when I die, I hope I come back as someone with real power, like a member of a focus group in Macomb County, Michigan, because that's where power lies. And it felt the same in Downing Street. You come in and you pull on all these levers and absolutely nothing happens. And you think power's with the newspaper proprietors or power's with someone else, and you try and get hold of it. The truth is that power is diffused in our society, and thank goodness it is. There isn't actually a very strong centre to the British government. You have to carry people with you, both in Parliament and your party, but in the country more generally. And that's a good thing.
And you actually, one of the striking things, I can't remember which part of the book it was in, but you say that the Prime Minister himself felt that he didn't really have power apart from the power of patronage.
Well, the Prime Minister technically doesn't have any power apart from the power to appoint people. He has no budget. He has no civil servants. The cabinet ministers are like feudal barons. They have these vast numbers of civil servants. They've got all this money they can spend. The Prime Minister can't do any of that. He has to try and broker it by appointing people or sacking them. And that's a very difficult thing to do, because when you sack them, they don't go away. They're still sitting there on the back benches making trouble for you.
Was there any point at all in your 10 years there where you thought, actually, I have got a bit of power now, I've actually located a bit of power and I can use it? Or was it,
no,
was
I
it
can't
more
say,
that influence?
I can't say that revelation ever. It always felt very, very hard. It always felt like Sisyphus pushing a rock uphill and you never got to the top. It never felt that you suddenly came to some nice, clean conclusion and you'd actually done something. I mean, looking back, obviously you did achieve things like in Northern Ireland and elsewhere, but it took an awfully long time and it was very piecemeal and it was usually done with someone else.
I mean, Northern Ireland doesn't figure a lot in this book, because you wrote a book about the Northern Ireland peace process before, where you played an integral part. I remember Anthony Eden's wife said that she felt the River Suez was running through Number 10. I get the feeling that Northern Ireland was sort of ever-present issue for you during your period.
It was. I sort of fell into it by accident, because as a diplomat I'd been in the embassy in Washington looking after the Northern Ireland portfolio. So I'd looked after the unionist politicians when they came out there. I'd fought against the visa for Gerry Adams, so I knew about Northern Ireland. So when we came into government, I made it my special subject. And our first visit out there, when Tony became Prime Minister in May 97, I sort of fell into it and then spent the next 10 years doing it. And that really was a Sisyphean task. But one I felt afterwards was really worth doing, something where you really had made a difference, although the credit belongs to the politicians in Northern Ireland rather than to anyone in London. But actually I had helped facilitate that, and that was something I really enjoyed.
Do you think it could have happened in the way that it did with a different Prime Minister? Because it seemed to me that Tony Blair had sort of the unique qualities to make that happen. And I think you'd probably agree. I mean, John Major started the whole thing off. And maybe he could have done it, but I think without Tony Blair, it would have actually been a much more difficult task.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, John Major deserves a lot of credit for starting it off. He had no political mileage out of starting it, but he took a brave decision to do so. But Tony Blair believed both that Northern Ireland could be solved and believed in himself in a way that John Major never did. Now, Tony was later criticised for believing in himself too much for other reasons. But in the case of Northern Ireland, it was crucial. In his book, he accuses me of saying that he had a messiah complex. But the truth was, it was Mo Mowlam who said that he thought he was effing Jesus. And there was something to that, but if he hadn't done so, he wouldn't have been able to bring peace to Northern Ireland.
It's interesting, because in your book, and indeed Alistair Campbell's diaries, Tony Blair seems to have a much bigger ego than maybe I had imagined that he had, but maybe all politicians do.
I think if you're going to be an effective politician, an effective leader, you have to want to be on the stage. You have to want to project yourself. So you have to have that sort of ego. But you don't necessarily have to be a prickly person or always want yourself to be on top, as it were. Because Tony was very good at taking criticism. Some leaders are not, but Alistair and I in particular were sometimes a bit too rough with Tony and trying to sort of prick him. You have the Seneca, the classical philosopher, advises that you should always remind yourself of your mortality every day, to remember that you're only human. And that Alistair and I regarded that as our task with Tony. Sometimes we were a bit too bold in doing that. But Tony was very good at taking that kind of criticism in a way that many other politicians, including John Major, were not. What would Machiavelli have made of Tony Blair? I think he would have seen him as a great leader. Machiavelli's real essence of a great leader is someone who has fortuna. Fortuna means a bit more than luck. It's something a bit grander than that. But you have to have this luck if you're going to be a great leader. But then you have to be able to seize it. So there are leaders who have luck, who have fortuna, but don't have the nous to seize it. Those who have the nous but never have the luck. He, like Mrs. Thatcher, was one who had both. Now, I accept that people in this country at the moment don't necessarily all agree with that. But I think in 20 or 30 years' time, they may come to that view. Now, initially in the book, you talk about the layout in Downing Street, how it's really not designed to be the centre of government. And you even contemplated trying to shift everyone into the Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre, which you clearly didn't end up doing. No. But just describe what it's like to work there, because you also say one of the first rules of government is that proximity to power is more important than comfort. And the working conditions in Downing Street, and I know I've been in there, I've seen how people work. I mean, it's not exactly luxurious, is it? No, I mean, you shouldn't feel too sorry for people working in Downing Street because they're desperate to be in there, and if you offered them a big comfortable office somewhere else, they wouldn't take it. But it's not at all appropriate for a modern government. It's an old country house, essentially. It feels very much like the set of upstairs, downstairs. And we had people working in bathrooms and loos because there just weren't enough offices for people. And by the end, the riser where the electricity was coming into the building was red hot because Gordon wouldn't allow us to do any repairs because he thought we were trying to keep him out of Downing Street. So it's completely unsuitable building. But when we tried to suggest moving out, no one was going to have it. All the cabinet ministers wanted to come through that famous front door, and so do all foreign visitors. So there's no way you can change it, unfortunately. But it does make it very hard for the Prime Minister.
And I had always imagined that the Prime Minister, and there was an office that the Prime Minister always sat in, but actually Prime Ministers tend to move around the building, and the office that Tony Blair had was not the same office that John Major or Margaret Thatcher had.
No, it always varies. Both Margaret Thatcher and Harold Wilson worked upstairs in a room that was Mrs. Thatcher's boudoir. She had decorated in wallpaper and had a little loo at the end of it. And the trouble with that is if you sit up there, your staff can't get to you. There's no way anyone can sit outside it, so anyone could barge in. Trying to end meetings is almost impossible. So that wasn't very suitable. Both John Major and Jim Callaghan worked out of the cabinet room itself, sitting at this great coffin-shaped table in this huge room. But it's a very, very odd place to work. You can't really get into proper working there. And certainly for Tony, who was allergic to sitting at a desk or table, couldn't possibly work there. So we started off by putting Tony in a tiny little room that had been Marcia Falkender's room. But it was extraordinarily small and very, very gloomy, and he soon got depressed in there. We had to move him into the room next to the Cabinet Office that had been the private secretary's room for generations. My brother, who'd worked there, was horrified that I'd given up my office to Tony Blair. But I noticed that David Cameron is still working there, so it obviously works in some way.
What do you think the main attributes for a political leader should be? I mean, you talk about the need to be optimistic, and you use a line in the book, which I constantly use, which was when I thought, no, I'm going to like this book, that optimistic politicians win elections and pessimistic ones generally don't. Now, that is a generalisation, but you go back in history and it is broadly true. But it's more about optimism. What other qualities do they need?
Well, there are two qualities they need to be born with, according to Machiavelli, and I think he's right. One is courage, and the other is intelligence. And by intelligence, he doesn't mean intellectual intelligence. He means a sort of emotional intelligence, ability to relate to people, ability to think politically, to have political instincts. Roy Jenkins said very unkindly about Tony that he had a second-class intellect but a first-class temperament. And there is something to that. It's actually a phrase originally applied to FDR. But there's something to that. Politicians need to have a first-class temperament if they're really going to govern a country well. They need to know what their electorate think without having to have focus groups and opinion polls. They need to get ahead of that opinion. They need to have political instincts, and not all do. Some politicians have real tin ears.
And, I mean, you talk again about courage and the fact that Gordon Brown wrote books about it but didn't actually have that quality himself.
Yeah, I just used Tony and Gordon as sort of counterpoints. You had Tony Blair coming in, changing clause 4, taking bold decisions. Gordon just couldn't make decisions. He found it really hard to decide one way or the other. He'd always ask for more information, another paper to be written, try and put off those difficult decisions. And as Machiavelli warns you, if you do that, you're actually going to definitely end up in trouble. You're better to take the wrong decision than to take no decision. But Gordon would get in this circle where he couldn't take decisions.
So I've asked you what Machiavelli would have made of Tony Blair. We're going to come on to talk about Gordon Brown a lot more a bit later, but what would he have made of Gordon Brown?
Well, he wouldn't. I think he'd had a real problem with his failure to take decisions, as I say. He would have compared him to Piero Soderini, his boss in Florence, and that would have been a real drawback. But I also think he would have thought he was not a very lucky Prime Minister or lucky leader. He never had the fortuna to take advantage of. If you think when he came to office, everything started to go wrong from the economy upwards.
Well, he had 3 months where he seemed to be an absolutely outstanding Prime Minister. Even I was thinking, my God, I've misjudged this man.
Yes, but actually very little happened, if you remember, during those 3 months.
Well, he dealt with a couple of crises quite well.
Quite small crises.
Is there anything good that you can say about Gordon Brown?
He hasn't yet written his memoirs.
Well, that just about says it all, doesn't it? Now you're listening to the voice there of Jonathan Powell. He's written a book called The New Machiavelli. We'll hear much more from him in just a few minutes' time. This is LBC 97.3. It's 9:30. You're listening to the LBC Book Club. Now, just to tell you what's coming up at 10, Anthony Davis will be asking if the new Metropolitan Police Commissioner's vow to be tough on crime is the right way forward. Should we be fighting disruption with more force? Is this the top priority for Bernard Hogan-Howe? Also, as Heathrow risks being overtaken by other European airports, according to members of the House of Lords, how important is it for London to have the world's busiest international airport? And as Amazon launches an online library Could this be the initiative which will reignite our love of books? All that and more with Anthony Davis from 10. No, it's this book called The New Machiavelli which should reignite your love of political books. It's by Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's Chief of Staff. 0845 6060 973 if you'd like to ask him a question. Carl in Woolwich has emailed to say, Jonathan, you have a strong interest in American politics, so what do you make of the fact that politicians in the US with a very cerebral image, like Michael Dukakis and John Kerry, never seem to get the top job there? Do you see a parallel in UK politics?
Yes, I think there is a point that British politics has become more presidential, and you want to have someone who you'd like to have in your living room rather than someone who is necessarily more cerebral. But it's a change, but it's a change of nuance. I'm not sure we ever really voted for people because they were brainy.
Now, we heard in the news there that Ed Balls has said sorry, which is something that I imagine you never thought you'd hear. He said sorry for the failure to regulate the banks properly. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it's very difficult for politicians to say sorry. It's one of the hardest things for them to do. It's very easy to apologise for other people's mistakes. We apologise for the Amritsar massacre, the potato famine, the imprisonment of the Guildford Four, but we've almost never apologised for things we did. So I think actually Ed's done a big thing here by apologising for something he absolutely was responsible for. He wasn't responsible for the Independent Bank of England, but he was responsible for this, for the regulation that we set up with the FSA and Bank of England, and apologising for it's a big act by a politician.
Now, you actually liked Tony Blair to say sorry because I remember, was it during one election campaign, Alistair Campbell and you decided to basically put him through the ringer and put him in front of an audience of people that were just going to harangue him because he was actually rather good in that situation.
Yeah, it was what was called the masochism strategy. I must say Alistair was a mastermind behind, not me, to put Tony through absolute hell because he was very good at handling an audience that would get very aggressive. Most politicians sort of freeze up in those circumstances, but Tony was very good at relating to them. The trouble was he was also in physical pain because he had a slipped disc at the same time. So having that physical pain and the emotional pain of dealing with an angry audience was almost too much for him.
So more parallels with Bill Clinton. He could feel their pain. Right, let's take a call from Keith in Rickmansworth. Hello, Keith.
Hello, Ian. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. Now, what's your question to Jonathan?
Well, firstly, I'd like to say I think it's a brilliant title because I think it could be applied to all governments, right back to and including Mrs. Thatcher, Machiavellian. I think it's a good title. It brings one thinking along the right lines. The question I wanted to ask you, Mr. Powell, is that it's recently come to light that Lady Bullock told Tony Blair that there were no weapons of mass destruction during the Iraq
you mean Eliza Manningham Buller, the former head of
I do mean her. And what I'd like to know is that did Tony Blair discuss this with you as his chief of staff?
Well, Eliza didn't tell. I was just actually at the Reef lecture. The last Reef lecture being delivered by Eliza just about an hour ago, and she didn't tell Tony Blair that there were no weapons of mass destruction. The point she's been making is that what happened in Iraq provoked more extremism in Britain and made us more of a target for terrorism. MI5, of course, is an internal security agency, not an external one. It's the SIS and others who look at weapons of mass destruction, and SIS was certainly telling us that they believed there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Well, I know that I listened to her Reef lecture as well, and she didn't say it in the Reef lecture, but before the Reef lecture, she did actually say that.
Well,
on air. She said it on air, because I heard it.
Right, but firstly, she doesn't come from the agency who would have any responsibility for that, so she wouldn't have any cause to say that. And secondly, she never did say that to Tony Blair, certainly in my presence, and I'm sure he would have mentioned it if she had said it.
You're sure he'd have mentioned it, are you?
I'm pretty sure he'd have mentioned it, because the fact was at the time, all of the intelligence agencies, not just the British ones, but the Russian ones, the French ones, everyone thought they had weapons of mass destruction. Now, the fact is, we were wrong. We got it wrong. But at least we were sort of honestly wrong, as it were, and accusing us of being dishonest actually hides the things that need to be learnt from Iraq.
If I could make a final point before going, Ian, because I know you're going to be talking about Gordon Brown, I think it's worth remembering that despite all Gordon Brown's problems, he was not defeated at the last general election.
Well, he was, because he's no longer Prime Minister.
He was not defeated. That's why we have a coalition. They did not.
Well,
the Tories
Labour
did
Party,
not get an overall majority.
Keith, let me give you some lessons in electoral facts. The Labour Party got 29% of the vote, and I think 258 seats. So he's not Prime Minister. So therefore, he was defeated.
It isn't. It is not therefore. It's not therefore at all. Gordon Brown, they're all saying, Gordon Brown will be defeated, they'll lose, they'll get an overall majority of the Tories, but they didn't.
No, well, Cameron didn't win, but Gordon Brown lost.
Well, if no one won, then no one lost.
Well, yeah, I think we're splitting hairs here, Keith.
No, I don't think we are. I think it needs to be thought about. I think the last word on Gordon Brown would not be written for about 10 years.
But do you think, Keith, that if there had been another leader of the Labour Party, they would have won rather than Gordon Brown? Given that
No, I don't think so.
You don't think
I
it made
think it
any
would have been
difference?
a similar. I think it would have been a similar result. I think it would have been a similar result. I think the problem of Gordon Brown, personality problem of Gordon Brown, is not relevant. What is relevant is that New Labour became a busted flush, and fortunately is a busted flush now. And the next Labour leadership must distance itself from Blairite policy.
Keith, I think, is an unreconstructed lefty. Would you accept that description,
Well,
Keith?
I'm a socialist, yes, and I
Indeed.
think that the Labour Party will not regain preeminence until they become more socialist-leaning.
OK, Keith, thank you very much indeed for your call. Keith obviously didn't learn the lessons of the 1980s, but let's not go there. Let's talk about Gordon Brown now, because you are incredibly rude about Gordon Brown in the book, with I mean, a lot of reason to be, it would seem. I mean, I've read, as I say, all of these other memoirs, Anthony Selden's history of the Blair years as well. None of those books, I think, put it in as stark terms as you do. The man was psychologically unfit to be Prime Minister. How on earth did Labour MPs allow him to become Prime Minister?
Well, I've tried to be... Believe it or not, the book was a lot more full of invective when it was first drafted, and partly under Tony's influence, I toned it down quite a lot before I actually published it. And what I've tried to do is just stick to the entries from my diaries of those times, recounting particular things that happened. But I agree that that obviously I had value judgments in my diaries as well, so it was not exactly a friendly account of him. But I think you ask a very good question. How was it we didn't let the British public know that this sort of person was going to take over as Prime Minister? I think that's one of the things we can be fairly criticised for. But of course the practical problem is, had we let the public know, how on earth could we have kept him as Chancellor? And if we'd sacked him as Chancellor, then he'd have been on the backbenches trying to unseat Tony and being the focus of opposition on the backbenches. So you're faced with a very difficult decision that Machiavelli would have relished.
But you see, in a sense, you've been far more honest in your book about him than I think Alistair Campbell has been in his diaries, where you actually catalogue several instances where it was suggested that he should be sacked. And I think on one or two occasions you really pushed that case with Tony Blair. Now, that was a case, I would argue, where Tony Blair did not display courage. And that if he'd taken the more difficult decision and got rid of him, because, I mean, effectively his whole premiership was dominated by this fight with his Chancellor. And it's amazing that it went on for as long as it did.
Well, he got a lot done despite the fight, so I don't think the fight actually stopped him doing anything he wanted to do. It just slowed it all down and made it more difficult and was a complete pain. And yes, you're right, I did argue several times for getting rid of Gordon. Tony did contemplate several times getting rid of Gordon. That would have been a courageous decision, but it might also have been a mad decision, because then you'd have put on the backbenches this strong political figure who would have been a centre of attraction to all people who were opposed to you. And you wouldn't have been able to remain as Prime Minister, you wouldn't have got the things done you wanted to, and the Labour Party would have collapsed. So it was a very difficult decision. I totally understand why Tony didn't do it. Had it been me, I would have got rid of him.
It's interesting because the mirror image of that is Gordon Brown's behaviour, really trying to bring Tony Blair down, constantly saying to him, why won't you let me take over? Why won't you go now? But never actually willing to stab the knife in so far that there was no going back.
Yes, he'd feint and withdraw was his policy, that he would come and attack and then just pull back at the last minute rather than... And the result of that was that he weakened the government rather than actually ever bringing Tony down, until he got to the final coup, where he finally went too far with the Balti House plot and all the rest of it, and then he couldn't pull back, and then things became very tense indeed.
Now, Gordon Brown surrounded himself with some interesting characters, it has to be said. Charlie Whelan, Damien McBride, Ed Balls, Ed Miliband. Let's talk about Ed Miliband for a second. He doesn't emerge from your book with particular praise.
No, but he's hardly mentioned in my book, to be fair. I mean, it was the two Eds operating as a team in which he gets referred in the sort of transitional team, but I don't think he comes out as a particularly malevolent figure at all.
What influence do you think he had over Gordon Brown?
Well, there was always a battle between the two Eds, and I think there's no doubt that Ed Balls came out dominant, and Ed Miliband was unseated by the cuckoo in the nest and found himself in a position where it was very difficult to influence things. I don't think there's any doubt that Ed Balls was the dominant figure.
And what would Machiavelli make of Ed Miliband? Because in a sense, Ed Miliband did have the courage to go for the leadership. He's actually taken a few risks, it's paid off for him, but he's now in the job. He's been in the job for nearly 12 months. First of all, what would Machiavelli make of him, and how do you think he's done over the first 12 months?
Well, as you say, Machiavelli would have approved of his boldness in taking on his brother and defeating his brother. He'd have seen no crime in that at all. He'd have been looking at it in a realistic point of view. The trouble, Fred, is that the main thing the British public remember him for now is that he was the person who did in his brother. And the issue that faces him is, how does he define himself as a leader? You only get very few chances in politics to get through to the public and try and get heard. And your first impressions are very, very important on the public. You have to find some way of breaking through if you don't do that. Now, Ed has not managed to make a first impression on the British public that defines him in a clear way, other than the person who did it in his brother. And he needs to find a way, particularly before we get to an election, where he can do that.
David Miliband. What advice would Machiavelli have for David Miliband now?
Well, his advice in 2007 would have been advice that we didn't give him and probably should have done, which was to run against Gordon. That was his time to run against Gordon, just as Gordon had his time to run against John Smith in 92 and should have done so, and having lost that opportunity had really lost his chance. And I think the same happened to David, unfortunately. I think his advice to David now would probably be the same advice that the Gordon Brown should have followed. Machiavelli is very clear. If you don't have the power to take power yourself, you should bide your time, keep close to the leader, be very sycophantic to him, and that advantage is that you stay alive. If the guy does well, you get to profit from it, and if he falls over, you get to take over. But Gordon can never follow that advice.
Going back to Gordon, tell us about Operation Teddy Bear.
I've forgotten what Operation Teddy Bear was.
Operation Teddy Bear was splitting the Treasury into, basically.
Oh, yes, that's what Peter called it. Yeah, it wasn't actually ever called Operation Teddy Bear, by the way. No, that's why I've forgotten. Now, we looked at it twice, at the idea of trying to split the Treasury. There's a real problem in the British government that financial decisions are taken by the Treasury, and policy decisions, personnel decisions are taken by the Cabinet Office. And what happens is the Treasury will set a series of objectives with money tied to them, and the Cabinet Office, Prime Minister, will set a series of objectives which are different, and they conflict. And you'd be far better if you could bring the two of them together, as, for example, in the United States, where you have Office of Management and Budget that has the money and has the policy and personnel aspects together with one set of objectives. And our idea was not actually about undermining Gordon in that case. It was actually about trying to build a sensible, coherent centre of government. But unfortunately, it was the risk of taking on Gordon and having a bloody battle with him that discouraged us from doing it the two times we looked at it.
Tony Blair once memorably said that he had the forces of conservatism scarred across his back, or words to that effect.
Yeah.
Is the civil service effectively the main force of conservatism in this country, where it's so difficult to persuade them to change the system?
It's interesting that David Cameron has said something very similar in his time in office too. I was a civil servant for 17 years, so I feel I can speak very frankly about the civil service. I think our civil service is amongst the best in the world, if not the best in the world. But there's a problem that people come in after university and leave when they retire, and there's this sort of monastic order, and they get very stuck in their ways and find it very hard to change. There isn't enough new blood coming in. If you look at the American system, you've always got new blood coming in, new people coming in, new ideas. And the trouble with the British system is, it is a really elite system, fantastic people who work incredibly hard, but they're always risk-averse. They never want to have change. And the biggest insult you can say to a politician as a civil servant is, that's very brave, Minister. And a system where brave is an insult is a problem.
Well, I'm with Jonathan Powell. He's the author of The New Machiavelli. It's in paperback by Vintage at $8.99. Came out 3 or 4 weeks ago,
yeah,
I think. And we'll hear more from Jonathan in just a few minutes' time. It's 9:45. And here's Alan Cowie with the LBC Travel.
Thank you, Ian. Problems in North London near Finsbury Park.
I can remember when Alistair Campbell came into the studio, when was it, back in March, to talk about his diaries. I said to him at the end of the programme, we could have easily done 3 hours on this, couldn't we? And he laughed and he said, yeah, we'll do that on the next one. And I kind of feel the same, even though your book is about sort of half the size of Alistair's
considerably
diaries.
Less than half the size of one of Alistair's diaries.
I mean, there's just so much to talk about in it. Let's have a word about reshuffles, because that was part of the book that I really enjoyed, because reshuffles are a bit of a mystery to many people, how they're conducted. Just give us a flavour of a typical Blair reshuffle, and some of the people that maybe you upset.
Yes, well, it's very difficult to do the reshuffles. People don't quite understand. There's a fixed number of ministers you can have under law. There's a parliamentary act that says you can have so many paid places. But it's not simple. There are a whole series of subcategories. You can only have ministers of so many ministers of states, and if you have them, you can't have so many cabinet ministers. And it's all legal. If you get it wrong, you're completely you're in terrible legal trouble. And the whole thing is completely done in chaos, because people will refuse jobs or refuse to accept people working for them. So the whole thing has to be reshuffled again and again. And Tony was a nice guy, and he didn't like sacking people, and people react in the most terrible ways. Some of them will burst into tears if they're sacked. Some get very, very angry and say they'll have their revenge. I remember one woman coming in expecting to be promoted to the cabinet and then sacked, and was just absolutely outraged. She thought something had gone completely wrong. He didn't
Barbara
understand.
Roach, just to prove that I've read the book.
And that's absolutely right. And then others refused to accept their sackings, and sort of insist on coming and arguing the case. And Tony, being again a nice guy, would try and let them stay. And then
I thought the Jeff Hoon one was quite a good one.
Well, Jeff was sacked, and then argued that he should be allowed to stay. And so Tony said, "Well, come and talk to me." So he came in and persuaded him he should stay. And Tony sort of indicated he was in the cabinet, sort of indicated he wasn't, and would be Minister of Europe, but didn't tell Margaret Beckett, the Foreign Secretary, that. So we had a bit of a to-do after that. But you can get in terrible trouble with the junior ministers in particular, because they don't come in. You have them on the phone, and they're stacked up like planes over Heathrow, and you have like 10 on the phone at a while, and they're put into the Prime Minister one at a time. And he's never quite sure who's coming next or what job it is. So you have to rush him with a piece of paper and stick it under his nose and tell him who it is and what job they're being appointed to. And that usually works, but occasionally you get the wrong thing. There was one occasion early on in our time in government, we were going to appoint Bernard Donahue, the distinguished lord who'd worked for Harold Wilson, to an agricultural job. And the switchboard, unfortunately, had got Brian Donohoe, one of our backbench MPs who was never in danger of being appointed a minister. And the switch put through Brian Donohoe to Tony, who's about to say, "Well, here's your job," when Brian unwisely spoke. And Tony immediately realised it was the wrong Donohoe and engaged him in a conversation about the political situation. And Brian was very impressed, and he told all his friends it was very nice. The Prime Minister, in the middle of a reshuffle, had stopped him on the motorway and talked to him on the phone about the political situation.
One thing that comes through from your book is that politics is really based on personal relationships. I suppose it's just like anything else. And if a Prime Minister gets on with a particular foreign leader, there will be positive consequences from that. I always remember Margaret Thatcher meeting Mikhail Gorbachev and saying, "Well, this is a man I can do business with." But the reverse can be true. I mean, she never got on with Helmut Kohl, for instance.
No.
Now, what about some of the interpersonal relationships that Tony Blair had with foreign leaders?
Yes, well, it's people don't quite understand, particularly at the level of international politics, how important that personal relationship is. My brother, as I said, worked for Helmut Kohl, and Helmut Kohl, first meeting with Mrs. Thatcher, when I think she was in opposition and he was in government, was in Salzburg, where she went on holiday. And Helmut Kohl broke up the meeting after half an hour, saying he had an important meeting to go to and had to leave. So Mrs. Thatcher was left with nothing to do. And she wandered the streets of Salzburg, only to see Helmut Kohl stuffing his face with a huge cream cake on a sidewalk cafe. She never forgave him, and they never got on again afterwards. Tony Blair went to great lengths to try and win over President Chirac, but could never quite get there with him. And also Prime Minister Jospin, who was the socialist prime minister working alongside President Chirac. And one particularly bold effort, we got Jospin to come to Tony's constituency in the northeast, to Sedgefield. And they had lunch at the Dun Cow pub. And then they went out to do a press conference, and Tony decided to do it in French, because he speaks reasonably good French, but not quite good enough French, as it turned out. And he was asked a question about cooperating with Lionel Jospin, and he said he looked forward to cooperating with Lionel Jospin in many different areas. And Lionel Jospin started giggling in the middle of this press conference on the doorstep of his house in Trimden Colliery. And Tony just carried on, and then afterwards said to Lionel, "Well, what went wrong there?" And he said, "What you actually said in French was, you desired Lionel Jospin in many different positions. So be careful when speaking another language."
And if you can recall what Lionel Jospin looks like, you'd know that simply wasn't the case. Now, Clayton in Dartford is texted to say, "Could you ask Jonathan, when Tony called Gordon the best chancellor this country has ever had, was he simply having a laugh?"
No, I think he thought Gordon Brown was both a towering politician, actually head and shoulders above most of the other people of his generation in British politics, and a very effective chancellor. I think he thought both of those things. They're not incompatible with the notion that he was not suitable to be Prime Minister. Sometimes people can be suitable to be Chancellor, but not to be a leader.
And Ish in Chigwell says, "Can we have your guest's opinion on Ken Livingstone, Boris Johnson and Brian Paddock?"
Well, I'm not sure my opinion is worth all that much. We did try a long time to keep Ken from being Mayor of London. It was one of our mistakes in government. We went to great lengths to rule him out of the election and have someone else, and then we had Frank Dobson, and then eventually we had to give in when it was perfectly clear the Labour voters in London wanted Ken. And actually I think he was a very effective man and stands a good chance of winning again next time.
Because the interesting thing there is, again, if you read all of the books about this, it seems to me that Tony Blair wasn't actually as worried about Ken Livingstone as you or Alistair Campbell or Peter Mandelson were.
Actually, again, I'm afraid the truth is it was Gordon Brown who was worried about Ken Livingstone. Gordon thought that Ken Livingstone, bizarrely, was a challenger to him for leader of the party. I don't know why he thought this, but he thought he was another person who could come through and be leader of the Labour Party instead of Gordon. And therefore he was particularly keen that we knock him out. Peter was more worried, Alistair. I was fairly neutral on it, but Tony, you're right, in the end saw the point that actually Ken Livingstone was a sort of populist politician who can really appeal. And he was very attached to this idea of elected mayors, and someone like Ken is absolutely ideal for that kind of job.
How do you cope with one day being at the centre of power in Downing Street, having the ear of the Prime Minister, and then the next day you're Joe Public? I mean, sort of June, what was it, June the 27th, 2007,
Yep.
out.
Yep. Well, I woke up the next morning with my radio on, and it was describing a attempted terrorist attack in the West End of attempted a bomb in a car. And I thought, my God, no one's called me. Why have the police not called me? No one's woken me up. Something's gone wrong. And then I thought, it's not my problem. And the nice thing when you leave power is it does feel like a monkey off your back. If you're doing it for a long period of time like that, 10 years, when it's off, you think, my God, what a relief. You can actually sort of stand up straight for a while. But then after a while, you start thinking, oh, it's a shame not to be at the centre, and aren't they making a mess of things, and wouldn't I do better? So you soon return to that sort of role. There is a problem with people leaving politics at a younger age now, particularly prime ministers. If you think of someone like Tony Blair, it's one thing for Mrs Thatcher to leave, who'd really reached the end of her career. But when you have people like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair leaving office, something needs to be found for them to do.
Now, I mentioned Anthony Eden's wife earlier about having the River Suez going through her drawing room. Well, your wife must have felt that she had Downing Street going through her drawing room, because she's written a play about it, a very successful play that's, I think it's just finished, hasn't it?
It's just finished.
I met one of the actors from it the other day. What was that like for you? Because it was basically about your experience, wasn't it?
It was very much about our experience. It was a sort of household drama about the issue of loyalty inside the home, when she was avidly opposed to the Iraq War, and I was, of course, instrumental in bringing about the Iraq War. So we had fairly lively discussions every evening. And she, of course, couldn't express her view. She was a journalist, but she couldn't write about what her view was, even though she went and took the children on the anti-war march and all the rest of it. So it was trying to capture that sense of loyalty. You've got your loyalty to your family and your wife, your loyalty to your boss, the Prime Minister, your loyalty to yourself and your integrity, and how all of those things, work out. But it was a pretty lively period, and it made a very good play, which, as you say, was successful. Sitting there watching it was a slightly out-of-body experience, seeing yourself and your wife being portrayed on the stage, and I sat through it 3 times, so I think I deserve some sort of medal.
Did you ever review it?
I didn't, no. I don't think that would have been very safe, no.
So what are you up to now, apart from writing books? What are you doing now?
I've set up an NGO called Intermediate, which does conflict resolution. It does what I did for 10 years in Northern Ireland, of trying to get contacts and negotiations going between governments and terrorist groups in all sorts of other parts of the world, which is fascinating to do, but difficult to get the financial support you need to do it, but well worth doing.
No thoughts about going into politics?
No, I originally aspired to be a Labour MP, and I wish in some ways I had been, but that wasn't to be. And once I'd got into the job in Downing Street, there was no way of making that transition. And now I'm much too old for it. Everyone's so young now.
It's interesting that, how many brothers have you got? Is it?
I've got 3 older brothers.
'Cause I know about Charles, and I know about the one in advertising,
Chris.
his name, Chris.
Yeah.
Is there a bit of sibling rivalry between you?
Well, actually, because we're quite different in age. Charles is 70 and I'm 54, so we're quite a big sort of gap in ages. We never really ever sat at the dining room table and discussed politics, so we don't have that sort of fighting spirit. I mean, I think we've taken different political paths, because Charles was Tory. Well, he was a civil servant, but he was Tory-leaning. Chris was Labour. Roderick, who lives in America, was Tory, and then me. So we've covered our bases. And of course, it goes back further. My grandfather worked for Winston Churchill when he was Home Secretary as his private secretary. And if you go even further back, there was Hugo de Morville, who was one of the 4 knights who followed his boss's instructions slightly too far and killed Thomas à Becket.
Well, what a brilliant way to end the programme. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming in. Absolute pleasure to talk to you. The New Machiavelli by Jonathan Powell, published by Vintage, $8.99 in paperback. I know I always recommend you to buy books that we have on the book club, but make sure you get this one. That's all we've got time for. That's LBC 97.3. Time for Mr. Anthony Davis.
Thanks very much, Ian. Yes, join me after the news and we'll continue London's biggest conversation with Bernard Hogan-Howe, who's landed Britain's top police job. We'll be asking what should his priorities be for London. Also, significant upfront investment in tough community sentences are needed if they are to be more effective than short prison terms. How happy will you be knowing that the perpetrator of a crime that you might be on the wrong end of might still be out in the community. And we'll be looking at Heathrow Airport, which is set to be overtaken by other European airports. I'll be asking, how important is it to you to live near the great hub of Europe? All that and more after the very latest news.